Welcome everybody. I am not Lisa Sorensen, even though it says that below my video. I'm Alex Sansom. I'm the Birds Caribbean Waterbird Program Manager. And thank you all for coming along this evening to our webinar. This is the second part of our Shorebirds of the Atlantic Flyway webinar, and we're still celebrating World Migratory Bird Day, so that's part of our celebration. So the talks in this webinar this evening all come from the AOS-BC Caribbean meeting that was held in the summer this year, and they're from a symposium with the same title as this webinar. And we had 15 talks during the symposium, so we're just sharing a selection of them with you here tonight. The talks in the symposium covered the highs and lows of wetland and shorebird conservation. And the talks were from across the Caribbean, but also beyond, and covered the Atlantic Flyway. Part one of our webinar is now on YouTube if you missed it last time. The three talks in that webinar were all from the Caribbean and mainly covered projects that were about preserving wetland habitats, engaging with local communities to do that, and also highlighting shorebird conservation issues with local communities. And tonight we're going to carry on that theme in our first talk, but then after that we're going to move on to consider the flyway and look at species conservation in the flyway and consider some of the other threats to shorebirds as well as habitat conservation. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Our first talk is a joint talk between Ajhermae White and Devon Carter. They are from Montserrat and Anguilla, respectively, and they're going to be talking about some habitat restoration and creation in the Caribbean on their respective islands. Let me stop sharing my screen and let Devon share the screen, and Ajhermae can start her talk. So you guys just start when you're ready.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ajhermae White, and I'm an Environment Officer at the Department of Environment in Montserrat.
Hi, everyone. My name is Devon Carter. I am a research assistant at the Anguilla National Trust in the beautiful Caribbean island of Anguilla.
And today we're going to be speaking about the Darwin Plus project that was led by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which is a UK nonprofit organization. And this project was called Restoring and Safeguarding Wetlands of the Caribbean UK Overseas Territories. Now, this project started in April 2019 and went until March 2022. And the project partners were Anguilla National Trust, Turks and Caicos National Trust, Montserrat National Trust, the government of Montserrat, and the Turks and Caicos government. Now, we also had Jos van Dyke Preservation Society as a partner as well, and they provided a lot of useful information for this project to be successful. So next slide, please. So the aims of this project were to reverse the loss and degradation of wetlands in Anguilla, Montserrat, and Turks and Caicos by sharing best practice of wetland conservation between the territories, by also developing and applying actual conservation and restoration measures, and by also creating safeguarding policy within the territories and to increase public awareness of the value of wetlands. Next slide. So for each island that took part in this project, an assessment was done to determine which wetlands would actually be a part of the actual conservation measures. So in Anguilla, Eastern Pond Conservation Area and Road Salt Pond was chosen. For Turks and Caicos Islands, Wheeland Pond was chosen. And for Montserrat, the Bellum Valley area was chosen. Next slide. Now, in Montserrat's case, there actually wasn't any established wetlands compared to the other islands, when the project began. So at first we had 2 small ponds in the Old Road Bay area, which is at the mouth of the Belém River Valley. And we're gonna speak about how these 2 ponds were actually created to a larger wetland. Next slide. But first I wanna mention how Montserrat has a history of wetland loss. Previously, we lost 2 wetlands. One of the first ones was Foxes Bay Bird Sanctuary. We lost that due to the volcanic activity where a lot of the ash and so actually filled in the pond. So we no longer have that pond. And the last pond that was left in the north of the island, which is Piper's Pond, was filled in because the town in Plymouth was totally covered with ash. So there was an idea to create a new town center in the Little Bay area. So Piper's Pond, which was a wetland in the north of the island, was filled in to make space for land development. So it was filled in about 2013, 2014. Next slide. Now, when it came to the entire Belém Valley area, we realized that whatever happened in the upper reaches of the valley would actually have an impact on what occurs in the lower reaches of the valley and the Old Road Bay area. So sand mining and aggregate mining actually take place in the upper reaches of the valley. And previously, this actual sector wasn't monitored. Now, this is Montserrat's only export, so it's actually an important economic stream for Montserrat, but it wasn't monitored before, and this project actually allowed for a rehabilitation action plan and a licensing system to actually be implemented on Montserrat for the sand mining sector. So from now, it's actually been it's been monitored weekly, and we're able to see how the changes in the valley are occurring due to the sand mining activities. Next slide. Now, this is a picture of the Old Road Bay area, which is at the mouth of the Belém River Valley. Now, usually this whole valley is usually dry. It doesn't run continuously. So in November 2020, there was a heavy rain event that caused this valley to be running like a constant river. And this was one of the first times in a while we've seen that. Now you can see the flat area, that's the Old Road Bay area. And interestingly enough, this area was totally the sea, before the volcano started with its activity. So the volcano allowed a lot of material to be coming down the Belém River Valley and extended the land, which you're seeing there that we call Old Road Bay. Now, a developer is actually creating a golf course and a beach bar in this area, which is quite risky, to be honest, because as you can see, this is what can happen when there is a high amount of rainfall. And in November 2020, that's what happened, and you could see the impacts of the area. So a lot of ditches were created along the coast, as you can see. And this actually helped us a lot because we weren't too sure exactly where we were going to expand this wetland to or where we're going to put it, but nature actually helped us and created these ditches filled with water. And we decided we were going to choose one and expand it to create a larger wetland. So next slide. So this is a picture of the area a few months after the rain event. You could see that a few of the ponds were still having water. And the largest one is the one that we used to create this larger wetland. Next slide. And this is a picture of the wetland in 2021. Since then, it was expanded even further to create some shallow areas for waders and other wetland birds as well. Next slide. So since the beginning of this project and since this wetland has been established and while it was being created, we started seeing so many different species of birds coming through, and it was so exciting to see that every year, especially during the migratory season, we were seeing so many different migrants. The shorebirds were coming through in their numbers, and we actually started seeing the common gallinules breeding in this area. We're noticing they're breeding multiple times per year. Just Saturday, I saw a new set of chicks, which I was really excited about. So we've been seeing lots of species that we haven't been seeing since Piper's Pond was filled in. Like, for example, this year we saw a stilt sandpiper, which was a shorebird species we hadn't seen in a while in Montserrat. Next slide. So a lot of public education was done for this wetland. We installed a sign at the entrance of the Old Road Bay area, and we also decided to put some signs that had the different pictures of all the, well, almost all the birds we have been seeing in the pond. And we also carried out some field trips, so the students were able to see some of the birds in the pond, and they were able to see like the blue-winged teals that were migrating and so on. We also did a radio show where we were explaining to the public everything that took place with this project and the importance of wetlands and how they're so useful for Montserrat. And the National Trust also did some planting of sea grapes along the border of the wetlands, so that could kind of put a buffer between the human activities and the nature that's occurring inside the pond. So that's about it for what we did with this project in Montserrat. So I'm now going to hand it over to Devon so he can explain what was done in Anguilla and Turks and Caicos. Over to you, Devon.
Thank you, Ajhermae. In Anguilla, the project focused on two wetlands: Eastern Pond Conservation Area, which is protected, and this Road Salt Pond, which is not protected, but is an important bird area. Both sites had bird counts and plant assessments conducted over the course of the project. And this is a beautiful map of Anguilla. The Eastern Pond is one of the most eastern, is on the eastern end of the island, while Road Salt Pond is more north central. These two ponds are part of a network of 25 wetlands on the mainland. We have an additional 5 coastal ponds on the offshore keys, but just to note, missing from the image is 3 keys: Sandy Island, Little Scrub, and Anguilla. Similar to Montserrat, we also conducted wetland restoration on our project sites. However, our activities focus on planting buttonwood, red, white, and black mangroves and sea grape seedlings rather than recreating a whole wetland system. Over the 3 years, with the help of school children, community volunteers, church groups, cooperative partners, we planted over 580 something trees, seedlings across the sites. We also did project site development and enhancement. At the Eastern Pond site, we built a viewing platform to encourage bird watching, and also we did signage so that people can understand what some of the birds, some of the most common birds in the area. As you can see the picture on the left with some of the ducks, you can see some of the egrets. Now to Turks and Caicos. Wetland Pond restoration. In Turks and Caicos was one of the islands severely impacted by Hurricane Irma in 2017. Wetland, located in Providence, is close to the community of Wetland and was severely impacted by solid waste disposal issues as post-hurricane cleanup of construction debris and other materials were dumped on the site. This is a map of where you can find Wetland, you know where the red star is the Wetland area. Turks and Caicos residents are threatened by dumping of household construction, vehicular waste, and unregulated treatment of mosquitoes. The project focused on the cleanup of the Wetland Pond and involved community actions along with deep cleaning professionals service to remove vehicles, the building waste, and the large appliances and the furnitures. Caribbean flamingo. So some of the Wetland Pond is frequent by charismatic birds such as the Caribbean flamingo, the great egret, little blue herons, white-cheeked pintails. Wetland is also visited by rare winter visitors such as the American avocat and the white ibis. Bird watchers visit the site as guided in a Providence book called Birding in Paradise, which is a booklet you can get in Turks and Caicos. Restoration. At the site, there was the construction of viewing platforms, just like Anguilla. walkways, and signage installed. The site is now attractive to the public with a growing interest in bird watching. As you can see, they have kids coming in and also doing bird watching. They was very happy to be there to see some of the new birds. Thank you. The project is considered a success in having partners deliver on all these amazing results on these sites in spite of all the setbacks and challenges presented by the COVID pandemic. We look forward to the results being adopted on other sites and sustained across all 3 territories. Thank you.
Great, thank you both so much. It's really great to hear about the wetlands being restored and created on all of those islands. Does anybody on Zoom here have any questions to ask Ajhermae or Devon about any of the work that they've been doing? I can't see. Oh, here's one in the Q&A. So in the Q&A, how did you guys extend the wetland in Montserrat?
So in Montserrat, remember the developer I mentioned that is creating the golf course and the beach bar. Now, initially when he was doing these things, he was doing a lot of digging and he was creating ponds by accident. And as soon as he did that, a lot of birds were coming, a lot of shorebirds and common gallinules. And he kind of a little bit started taking pride in the fact that these birds were showing up, and he kind of felt like a little environmentalist, the fact that he was creating a habitat for these birds. And so we kind of took him on board in this project, and we paid him to actually expand these ponds and using his heavy equipment, removing some material and putting it elsewhere. The water level was quite high, and he also helped to maintain the water level by creating some deeper areas, which would allow the pond to have access to the water table. And shallow areas were good as well for the waders. So we were using the developer that was creating the golf course to help us expand the wetland. And he was quite pleased with that. And, you know, we had lots of conversations with how much land he wanted for his golf course and how much we would like, well, we obviously wanted the wetland to be as big as possible. So we had lots of discussions with him and then came into an agreement of how big the wetland would be. But the golf course as well has been very helpful with attracting migratory birds and resident birds. We have lots of egrets there who sometimes visit the pond. And this year, for example, we were seeing the American golden plover for the first time in many years on the golf course. So when we do our bird surveys, we don't just survey the pond, we also survey the entire golf course area too.
Thanks, Ajhermae. Benoit, do you want to ask your question? You could just unmute and ask it.
Yeah, sure. Yes. Hi, Ajhermae. Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering if there were plans to monitor the progress of the work, the restoration work, like maybe like plant colonization and things like that. And is there a risk that the pond dries up? I'm assuming it's mostly rainwater. I mean, you mentioned that the river filled up once, but I'm assuming this is pretty rare. So yeah, just curious where the water is coming from.
So the water is fed underground because it's at the mouth of a river valley. Usually the surface of the valley is dry, but if you dig a little bit, you will start finding water. So it's deeper than the rest of the land. So that's why it's filled with water. And since then, we haven't had any issues with it drying. We did notice that there has been like fluctuations in the levels of the water, but I guess that's between the dry and the rainy season. So we've been monitoring it. And when it comes to the vegetation, we do have a little bit of a concern with the cattails, which seem to be taking over quite aggressively in the pond. Sometimes we have to go in and remove some because then you probably won't even be able to see any birds. But these cattails have been super beneficial, specifically for like the coots and rails. I didn't mention as well that we saw a purple gallinule for the first time in many years. That was my first time seeing a purple gallinule on Montserrat. But he was hiding in the reeds, he was using the reeds as protection, and the common gallinule as well has been nesting there too. So we don't want to remove all the reeds, but we have to maintain it a lot.
Great, thanks so much. So I think we'll move on to our next speaker. If there are any more questions, we can probably fit them in at the end. So our next speaker is Larry Niles. He is going to be speaking about shorebird conservation across the flyway, across the whole of the Atlantic Flyway, using red knots as a model species, with an example of like the difficulties facing conservation and the threats to shorebirds in the flyway. So I'll let you go ahead, Larry. I'll mute myself.
Thank you. How do I get to my...
Have you hit share screen at the bottom? Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. And if you do it as a presentation.
Sorry. How do I get it to go start at the beginning?
Hang on. Is this open? Is this PowerPoint we're looking at?
Yeah, it is.
So if you go back, if you just hit back, it should go back to the next slide.
Yeah, it's not responding to my...
Okay.
Okay, good.
There we go.
So,
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure talking to this group, but also to listening to these talks, because we also do habitat restoration, but here on Delaware Bay. So it's interesting to hear it, how it occurs in other places. So I'm talking about red knots now. So it's very specific to this species, but where red knots occur is often at least 3 or 4 other species. So it's a good species to talk about most Arctic nesting migratory species. So the knot in our flyway is the Rufa subspecies that breeds in the Canadian archipelago, Arctic archipelago, and then there's these other populations that migrate similarly down other long distance flyways. Essentially, the knot is going down into each of these extremes of the hemisphere, including ours down wintering in Tierra del Fuego. But there's also wintering populations in Florida and the Caribbean islands and northern Brazil. Now, the way that these shorebirds do this is by, red knot does this, is by amassing tremendous amounts of fat. Oop, that's happening on its own. I wonder if I should. So they build up enormous amounts of fat, and then that fuels these long migrations over the ocean and across South America. But it also includes these short distance birds that go to Florida and the Caribbean, which have a different strategy, same species, but basically a long and short distance strategy. So we've done a lot of work. God, I don't know why I should doing that. We've done a lot of work on red knots throughout the flyway, from Chile, Brazil, Argentina. I've worked in Texas and the East Coast states, as well as the Arctic. So there's we've banded over 17,000 knots, but there's been hundreds more banded by other researchers in other locations. So there's a great well of understanding here. So we're putting on satellite transmitters, and we developed a new method that doesn't require harnesses. Harnesses have always been a sort of difficulty for species like the knot, because because of that fat that they build up. It's really hard for us to attach harnesses. So we've used a method now where we're attaching the transmitters with glue and 2 sutures that dissolve in time for the transmitter to fall off. Now, these data have really opened up our understanding of knots. So this is just data from this year. The one on the left is called a Sunbird Tag, and it's solar. And so it's collecting multiple locations each day. And so it provides a really unique experience because, see, up in the Arctic, we were able to get so many locations that we can actually define the home range in the Arctic. And then in the stopovers, like Atlantic coast and New Jersey, we're getting these detailed use areas so that we could understand the habitat better. It's also given us this really good understanding of the behavior. Like in this case, this bird went out into the ocean intending ultimately to go to French Guiana, but encountered a storm, went back into Monomoy Refuge, and then worked its way down to the coastal New Jersey, and then went back off towards its wintering area. Here's multiple tracks of different birds that we did this year. So I'm going to just go through the areas that they occur to give you a sort of feel for the threats that they occur. In the Arctic, it's an area the size of the East Coast, so it varies wherever you are. These triangles are places where we've located birds with transmitters in the early days when it was just the VHF transmitters. So in the Arctic, it's mostly natural, the normal predatory threats. And then there's the problem, that occurs everywhere from climate change, but that's yet to express itself in the birds in the Arctic. On the southbound, the dangers or the threats are much more severe because it occurs mostly during August and September when the beaches are filled with people. And so there's that disturbance threat. And then there's also from migratory raptors, that is growing threat because in the US, the states have managed peregrines, released them so that they could have resident populations in places where peregrines have never really occurred, like in the August in these places. So it just creates another threat. And then as you go into the Florida Caribbean area, it's the same in that it's disturbance is a big problem, development, and then as Benoit will describe, there's also hunting. This was a picture taken in Guadeloupe when we went there to visit with Anthony Levesque. And then in northern Brazil, the threats are entirely different because it's mostly rural and unpopulated. In the places where it is, there's some threat from pollution, but mostly the land is, the birds are unaffected. So in the northbound, I'm just going to collapse it all into the problem we have on Delaware Bay, where birds would come from the south, either the Caribbean or northern Brazil or Tierra del Fuego. They would come to Delaware Bay to double body weight on horseshoe crab eggs. This is what it looked like before the horseshoe crabs were over harvested. So the eggs were so thick that we'd have, windrows of eggs. So shorebirds were gorging on these eggs. We had 1.5 million shorebirds at this time. This is what it looks like today. If on a good season, like this may occur only 1 or 2 days during the season. And the population of shorebirds has crashed. So it's gone down to somewhere around 200,000 birds. Knots went from about 90,000 in the 80s till now somewhere around 12,000 this past year. So the programs to protect shorebirds on the Atlantic Flyway are many. There's the Atlantic Flyway Initiative, which covers the entire flyway, the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Fund in the US, which funds mostly South American Caribbean projects. There's WISRN, the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, that mostly recognizes places. It doesn't really do that much conservation. I'm actually a member of the board on Western. And then the red knot is listed in the US, it's listed in Canada, and it's recognized in Argentina, Brazil, and other South American countries. So there's a lot of protection for red knots, but yet they're still in decline. So the lower graph is the count that we've been doing in Tierra del Fuego for now 25 years. And you can see that the numbers have went down and they're not recovering. The same is true in Delaware Bay. So why are these birds in decline and not recovering? Well, the first is the obvious answer. Most species, most migratory shorebirds in steep decline. The red knot just is sort of the most visible part of that decline. In the US, the problem is that there's science, which, I'm, been doing this for 30 years. And, in the beginning, there was really a lack of understanding. So any science would have a significant effect on policy and regulation. But see, now we're getting into this phase where people are employing these untested models that are relying on minimal information. They're Bayesian models that essentially model their own probability curves so that, you don't need that much data. And unfortunately, my experience is that they're being used to favor industry. The other problem is a little more subtle. I don't know if you noticed this in the Caribbean, but in US and in many of the countries in South America, the agencies and foundations won't fund advocacy. And it's an odd way of characterizing conservation, because industry is advocating all the time. They're in the meetings, they're, contributing to politicians that are affecting regulations and policy. But if we want to challenge a policy or a regulation, then it's called advocacy, and the foundations and agencies won't fund it, so that your work is limited to conservation that's more in the field. And then this is also another subtle, but I think pervasive influence, is that the conservation groups are often forced to compete for money against each other. And so agencies have to basically choose this action over that action. But it also prevents a lot of collaboration that could be occurring if if money was granted in a more collaborative way than in this combat way. So I'm going to go into this one at a time. So most sites, the first is that my experience anyway is that conservation can really only be delivered by the site. That in the US anyway, we've been trying these large scale efforts to help shorebirds. Predator control is an action. It's like, we're going to control predators, and then it's being implemented in all the various sites. But what if a site doesn't have a predator problem and the threat is coming from somewhere else? So these large scale actions, they don't really help in the decline of an individual site. And so I think it's better to focus conservation in specific locations instead of over large areas. And the sort of second reason for that is that in the places that I've worked in, most sites are where you have a problem for shorebirds. There's usually problems for most other species that are occurring in that site. And there's groups already in those places that are trying to ameliorate the threats. And so, a lot of times shorebird people will come in and try to resolve the threat for a shorebird, while there's other groups trying to tackle the same threat. So it's better to focus on sites and to focus on collaboration amongst groups rather than create this competitiveness that we often see. The other advantage of working in sites is that you are working with the people that live there, and that could have an enormous influence, and not only in the expert knowledge from the area, but in volunteers taking part in work. Like we did a lot of work in the Brazilian Resex reserves in Maranhão and Pará. And, I think that's the best of the whole flyway, where, the resources of the reserve are dedicated to the traditional communities in that area. And so, there's a very tight connection between protecting the resources of an area and the welfare of the people that live there. So that way you're tying together conservation of animals with the conservation of traditional communities. And then last, this idea about foundations loosening the restrictions on advocacy. The truth of the matter is conservation groups are a very small voice in the overall destruction of natural resources. And, that competition that we now have for money makes it very difficult for collaboration. And it also restricting money to just actions that help animals, but not the advocacy that's necessary to fight unwise resource policy or regulation, really makes it difficult to actually protect shorebirds. Like right now, the main problem on Delaware Bay isn't, we are trying to restore habitats and do the science work, but the main threat is the action of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission that's now creating a proposal. It's out for public review to start the killing of female horseshoe crabs. Right now, it's restricted to males only. So, and if you're a group that you can't fight this with money from, say, the Fish and Wildlife Foundation and a lot of the other foundation, because they will stop you from doing advocacy. So these are my ideas about improving shorebird conservation in the flyway. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
Thanks so much, Larry. That's given us a lot to think about. Yeah, has anyone got any questions for Larry or wants to think a bit more, and we can ask questions at the end? I can't see any in the Q&A. I mean, what you're saying about advocacy is so relevant to a lot of what's going on in the Caribbean with development and development pressure. And yeah, the need to involve local communities, all of that is just extremely relevant to wetland conservation in the Caribbean. Let's see. So yeah, could you kind of explain a bit more about why advocacy is discouraged by funding agencies, I guess?
See, a lot of the agencies and the foundations don't want their funding to be used to go against government policies or to confront powerful industries. And so there is money available to do that, but it's not the main sources of money. And so that's the idea, is that, see, the perspective is that if I'm going against a government policy, then that's advocacy. But if an industry is going either against a policy or they're supporting a policy that's destructive, that's not advocacy, and it's self-funded. Industry doesn't have to fund their activities. The fact that they're making money off of that policy is reason enough for them to do their own advocacy. But that resource doesn't exist for those who are trying to create a voice for wildlife. I mean, that's what it really is. It's creating a voice for wildlife in these decision-making processes that really don't give a significant weight to wildlife.
Yeah, I agree. So I think we need to move on to our next talk, but there might be some more time to discuss things like advocacy and funding for advocacy at the end of the session. So let's let Benoit take over, and he's going to be talking to us. So Benoit works for Environment and Climate Change Canada. He's going to be talking to us about harvest in the Atlantic Flyway. I think this is going to be a bit of an update. Is that right, Benoit?
Yes, exactly. So we're going to keep expanding from the Caribbean and further out. But yeah, I'm always happy to get a chance to talk a bit about shorebird harvest, because it's a file that's dear to me. And it's a complex file, obviously. It's a complex topic, but I'm going to try to give a brief overview of what's happening with the shorebird harvest and what kind of recent actions we've been able to do. And I'll focus mostly on recent work in Martinique and Guyana. But you'll see it's a pretty complex file. So, and the situation is very different from one place to the other. But briefly, the shorebird harvest issue kind of came to fame, if you want, in the early 2000s, when two whimbrels, Machi and Goshen, were shot by hunters in the French Antilles. And because these birds were followed, their migration was followed by tracking, it raised some concerns about harvest. And more recently, on a separate but similar projects, there's also two lesser yellowlegs, A65 and 02A, who also were shot in the French Antilles. And so given the number of birds that are actually equipped with transmitters is pretty small, the fact that these birds get shot it can be concerning. And so since the early 2000s, there's a group that came together under the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative, working on harvest. And really what I'm going to present today is a bit a collage of everybody's work and contribution to this group. But I do want to mention that the US Fish and Wildlife, the Canadian Wildlife Service, and the Office Français de la Biodiversité are all national kind of wildlife agencies. They're all involved. But we also work with NGOs like the New Jersey Audubon, Save Brazil, GPOG in French Guiana, and also individuals, whether they're local supporters of shorebird conservation, but also including hunters in some areas. And so the hunting overview, the hunting situation overview is we kind of have two things happening. We have a sport harvest, which is occurring mostly in the Caribbean. And then we have subsistence harvest, which is occurring mostly in South America. There are some differences in the different places where harvest is occurring. And so, for example, in the French territories, harvest is legal and it is regulated. So there are mechanisms in place to regulate harvest, similar to what's happening in the US and Canada. We have harvest mechanism, we implement management measures, we track the harvest and population. And so at least from a Canadian government perspective, that's what we're trying to bring to the table, is that it's that experience managing harvest, but also how we do it and the data that's behind it. And so we have this situation in the French territories. Then we have other places like Guyana, where harvest is legal, but basically unregulated. Most species can be taken at any time of the year without any restrictions. And then you have places like Suriname, where harvest is actually illegal, but is occurring and there's no real enforcement. So you can see that there's all kind of these different situations, which really complicates things, but we're trying to, you know, go one topic at a time. And so the group has an action plan, and we have a series of strategies that we're trying to work on. So we're looking at assessing the biological and social aspects of harvest. So that means getting more data on shorebird harvest and shorebird population, but also trying to understand the social aspect of harvesting. So is it sport hunting? Is it subsistence? If it's subsistence, what part, you know, does it play in people's daily livelihood? So I'll talk a bit about this strategy more for the two examples I have, Martinique and Guyana, because these are recent updates. But there's also, you know, other things. So we want to try and develop policies and regulations where there's a framework in place, strengthen law enforcement and monitor compliance. So that would be a good example of something we'd want to try and do in Suriname, for example, where there are laws but no enforcement. We want to improve outreach and communication. That's always, you know, a challenge, especially when you're dealing with a topic that can be sometimes, you know, spark polarizing interests. And so we're really trying to bring this to the surface. And I mentioned earlier that this whole project and the working group, you know, kind of came together when Mashi and Goshen, the first windmills, were shot. And that's a good example of how this topic can be brought to the surface, because it's sometimes, it can go under the radar sometimes. And so, so yeah, just getting the message out there that this is happening, and what are the solutions to make this more sustainable. Establishing and maintaining no shooting reserves, that's actually very specific to Barbados. I'll touch briefly on this later. Build capacity with partners, that's very important. I mentioned that, you know, in Canada and the United States, we have agencies and we have laws and regulations that have been in place for a long time. But we find that as we work on this truly international file, there can be additional capacities in the Caribbean, but also especially in South America. Lastly, evaluate interventions and shorebird response. So monitoring if there is a shorebird population response after we've implemented some of these measures, and develop incentives not to hunt. And I'll touch on this a bit about the Guyana example, because there are some, you know, significant social implications. And so I don't want to spend too much time on you know, maths, but I do want to mention that what we're really trying to achieve is sustainable harvest. And so right now we believe that the overall harvest that's occurring in the Atlantic Flyway is probably higher than what most species can support. And so what we're looking at doing is evaluating what's the potential biological removal, the PBR. And so there's a formula here, but basically it's how much can we take from a population given its size and given its natural growth. And so, and then how much do we want this population to recover? So if it's you know, doubling that population, then that PBR, that potential biological removal, must be much smaller. And so that's really what we're focusing on in a lot of those places, trying to estimate what is that number to try and make harvest more sustainable if it's above the PBR. And so I'll briefly touch on the Martinique example, because that's one place where harvest is legal and there are regulations in place, and there are also tools and data available. And so what we did for Martinique is we used annual surveys, which are given to all hunters, and they fill this out once a year. But they only estimate their total harvest for the year one time. But additionally, we also had hunters' logbooks. And so these logbooks are filled in at every outing. The difference between the two is that the annual surveys is filled out by all hunters, but the logbooks were not, you know, provided for all hunters. And so we use the information of both of these sources to try and estimate the total shorebird harvest. And so you can see on the graph that the gray dots are actually what people were estimating in their annual harvest, what all hunters were estimating for their collective total number of shorebird harvested. But when we took into account the logbooks, which are more detailed, we were able to kind of fill the gap and really get a better idea of what the actual harvest was. And so we have here for from 2012 to 2020 the total harvest for shorebird harvest total take for shorebird harvest. So you can see that we're somewhere between 4,000 to 8,000, and that's all species together. And with the same information, we were also able to split it out between species. And so I apologize for the 4-letter codes here. I'm used to using those, but basically the species that's the most harvested in Martinique, but it's also the case in the Caribbean, is the lesser yellowleg. It's about 50% of the the total harvest. And so with that information, the French government in the past 2 hunting season was able to propose regulatory changes, because what they realized is that in some cases in Martinique and Guadeloupe, their percentage of the potential biological removal, the PBR that I mentioned before, was proportionally very high for relatively small islands. And so they in recent seasons, some hunting was closed for some species where harvest was probably higher than it should be. So for Wimbrel, Hudson and Godwit, short-billed outwitcher was closed on one of the 2 islands, ruddy turnstone and solitary sandpiper. And I'm mentioning the 2 islands. One of them is Martinique and the other one is Guadeloupe. So really what we're trying to do is bring in information based on data that helps us make a good decision. And additionally, they also installed daily bag limits. So there's a daily bag limit of 20 birds over all the various species, but there's also a specific daily bag limit for specific species, like the lesser yellowleg. And the idea here is to not close the hunting completely, but really bring it down to a level that is more reasonable, more sustainable, and also try to avoid episodes where there's a few people who harvest a lot, a large number of birds, because these are usually the type of situations that have a big impact on birds. So having daily bag limit makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, with the recent weather conditions and tropical storms like Fiona, there's been lots of reports from the field that shorebirds were collected in large numbers, because when there are storms, shorebirds use the Caribbean as refuges. And so that's a bit concerning, but it really reinforces my belief that having these daily bag limits are a good way to make this hunting more sustainable. And so very briefly, I just want to talk about, again, that potential biological removal, because there's been a study tracking lesser yellowleg, and really what we're using to estimate the PBR is usually the overall population. And in this case, what we realize is that there's really only a small population of the lesser yellowlegs that will migrate to the Caribbean. And so really the PBR that we're currently using and estimating should probably be brought down, because the overall population that's actually flying through the Caribbean is so much smaller than the full size population. And so that just shows that these eastern breeding birds here that come from Eastern Canada are have a much higher probability of being in one of the harvest zones during harvest. And so that's been a concern of us, in terms of understanding which population are subject to harvest. And so that will be something that we'll continue to work on. And so the availability of new tracking methods, like Larry was mentioning, is really helpful in getting new kinds of information and inform management. I want to touch briefly on Barbados. I just want to mention that one of the objectives was to try and limit the number of shooting swamps, and in recent years, it has been the case, except like I mentioned before, there's been reports from the field that there were large takes of shorebirds recently. So that's something that we'll try to monitor a bit closely. But generally speaking, there's been a shift in Barbados from shooting swamps that were, with active shooters, moving towards shooting swamps that were maintained as reserve without any shooting for shorebirds. So that's also a direction that we'll try to pursue in the future. Very briefly, I'm moving out of the Caribbean, but I just want to talk about recent work in Guyana. I mentioned one of the strategies initially is to really get more and better information, and so we're still trying in many places to have a better idea of what's the size of the harvest. And so this recent work by Brad Andres and colleagues in Guyana is helping us do that. And so what they did there is they went and they did beach surveys to look at the numbers of people who were harvesting shorebirds, and they also did market surveys. Because I mentioned earlier, in the Caribbean, we have a lot of sport hunting, but in South America, it's quite a different situation where people are harvesting shorebirds for subsistence. So they're not using shotguns, they're using shucking wires, which is basically a fence that they will raise on the beach, and it's a line of very sharp wires, and that when shorebirds fly through, they get hurt and or they die, and that's how they collect shorebirds, and then they're sold to markets. And so this study allowed us to get a better estimate of how many shorebirds were getting harvested in Guyana. And so their conclusion was that approximately 28 or roughly 30,000 shorebirds were harvested at only 2 beaches in September, and that maybe 25 to almost 30% of these birds were sold to markets. So it's really quite a different situation, which will require a different approach than say in places where there are regulations and harvest is for sports. And from the same study, about 8,000 shorebirds were sold at markets. And in the case of South America, earlier I mentioned that in the Caribbean, lesser yellowleg is one of the species that's the most harvested, whereas in South America and in Guyana, for example, we're looking at mostly smaller peeps, which includes lesser yellowleg, but also other smaller species like small sandpipers, Calidris sandpipers. And so, I've presented different things, and it's like I mentioned, it's pretty complex because things vary from one country to the other. There's very different situations, but I think maybe as a take home message, we estimate that currently there's about 200,000 shorebirds that are being harvested annually in the Atlantic Flyway. There's about 12% coming from the Caribbean, but about 87% are harvested in South America. And most importantly, coming from Suriname, where, if you remember, I mentioned earlier, harvest is illegal, but there's little enforcement. And then in Guyana, where we actually, unfortunately, raised the bar, we got a better estimate of how many shorebirds were being harvested. And so in terms of conclusion and next steps, shorebirds population are declining faster than hunting pressure is declining, because there seems to be a small decline in hunting pressure overall, but there's still a sharper decline of shorebird population, which means that even though historically maybe hunting wasn't a problem, it probably is now. It's probably additive to all the other issues that shorebird populations are facing. So this will require some work to work with people who have been harvesting for a long time and try to, with the right information and the right data, start to make changes, because today, as we're looking at the situation, hunting is probably becoming a bigger issue than it used to be. We want to work in South America mostly, but also continue the good work that's been happening in the Caribbean. And so I know I'm a bit over time, so I'll stop here. I know I see Alex is coming back, but really, I mean, I just want to say we want to keep working on getting better data, good data, and to help support and inform management implementation in the Caribbean, especially, and in South America. We need to start working on good messaging, outreaching, and developing partners capacities. Thank you.
Thanks, Benoit. It's okay to go over a little bit. I'd noticed we're running slightly over time, but I still think we should have some questions for you because this is an important issue.
Sure.
So we have one question in the Q&A. So how good is the data on numbers of wintering and migratory shorebirds on Martinique? There can't be many whimbrels, for example.
No, exactly. And that's the one of the problem is that we have now with the logbooks and the surveys, we have a good idea of how many birds are harvested, but we're lacking the number of birds that are migrating through or overwintering. And so improving that information is going to be critical. But at least the information from the hunters is very helpful because you can compare one year to the other and you get estimates. But that's the reason why whimbrel is one of the species that they closed hunting for, is because even though there aren't a lot of whimbrels migrating through, there were still quite a few that were harvested, at least more than the potential biological removal should be. So that's why that decision was taken.
Okay, and I might just follow up from that. So what do you think are the best ways to get a better idea of the kind of turnover and the numbers of birds coming through the Caribbean?
Yeah, no, good question. And I mean, ideally we want to have long-term surveys conducted. Like the Caribbean waterbird census, for example, is a good way to do this because we have repeatable surveys that statistically we can use to estimate shorebird population, and so that's a great tool. So yeah, I think we want to have this long-term repeated surveys at different places.
Great. Okay. I think I can't see any more questions in the Q&A. Aaliyah, are there any? Oh, is there one in the? Oh, here we go. There's one in the chat.
Alex,
yes.
I would like to add something as well.
Oh, yes, go ahead, Larry. Yeah.
Benoit, when we were working in French Guiana, the amount of rice fields, like what we saw, we saw hunters, but we saw many shotgun shells. And, what we discovered there for the first time was a concentration of red knots that has since been verified by our tracking data. And see the difference, I know that the knots are not, they're not numerous enough to even make it to your survey. But it just seems to me that whenever there is a gathering of shorebirds, like what was happening there, we saw 2,400 knots in one place, and they're close together. Knots typically, when they're foraging, will forage in a flock that if you fired a shotgun at them, you would kill many birds, not just one or two. And it just seems like an intractable problem that if on this side, we got our act together and we started improving shorebird populations, it just seems like it'll just encourage more hunting in South America. Is that a reasonable perspective?
I mean, yeah, just to address the first thing you mentioned, like the fact that they're in group is a big issue, right? Because if you're using a shotgun, there's always going to be birds that get hurt, and we have no way of measuring that. Even in waterfowl and ducks and geese, there's been studies that have tried to look at how much damage there are to birds that are hurt, not necessarily collected, and it's very hard to estimate. So there's that's a big unknown, but definitely the numbers are much are higher than what I presented just by that fact. And so yeah, I mean with the the recovery of some population, again, if I take the example of ducks and geese, and we're talking maybe in 100 years, like it's the case for waterfowl, but if we had healthy population that were able to support harvest, sure, why not? That potential biological removal might be high enough that, some people, especially in places, for example, where there's subsistence, and it's an important cultural aspect of their daily livelihood. Yes, but right now the situation is, for all of these species, the populations are declining so fast and the populations are so small that harvest right now is probably this much, it's that additive, it's just a bit too much and just prevents them from recovering. So yeah, I mean, because the example I can give about shorebirds is snipes and woodcock in North America. They're, they have good populations and they're managed and they're harvested. So there are cases where it's possible, but when we're looking at those long distance migrant right now, I think most of those populations can't support a lot of harvest for sure. Thanks, Larry. Good question.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks both. I think we should probably start wrapping up for this evening, but I just want to say thank you to everyone who attended the webinar today, and also a big thank you to all the speakers for the fantastic talks that you gave. Kind of nice to have some varied talks on different topics, so I hope everyone found them all interesting. There will be a recording of the webinar up on YouTube in a couple of days, so I can share that with everyone if people want to rewatch. So yeah, just wanted to say thanks to everybody, and good night to everyone.
Hi, thanks, Alex. Thanks for organizing and the invitation.
That's fine.
Good night,
Okay.
everyone.
All right,
Good
good
night.
night. Thank you for having me.
Good night. Thank you.